The smoke rose every morning without fail, thin and grey, a single thread pulling itself loose from the frozen ground and dissolving somewhere above the dead grass. Harold Voss had stood on that hillside 4 times now, and 4 times he had walked away with nothing but cold boots and a sharper fury than when he arrived. He was not a man accustomed to being made to look foolish, and yet here he stood again in the pewter light of a November morning, staring at smoke that had no right to exist rising from earth, that should have held nothing but rock and dormant root. He turned a slow circle, scanning the white expanse of the hillside in every direction. No structure, no door, no chimney pipe he could put his hand around. Just the smoke, patient and indifferent, climbing past his face, as if to remind him it had been there long before he arrived, and would be there long after he left. He had told the town it was a natural phenomenon, gas escaping from underground. He had said it with the flat certainty of a man who understood how things worked, and most of Harwick had nodded and moved on. But a handful had laughed, and the laughter had a shape to it he recognized, the shape of a joke told at his expense. Somebody had said in the saloon that maybe old Voss just couldn't find his own reflection in still water, and the room had gone warm with it. Voss had heard about it by morning. He had not laughed. He turned back toward the town now, with the smoke still rising behind him, and the knowledge sitting low and hard in his chest. The girl was out there. She was alive, and she was winning. Harwick, Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1886 was a town that believed in itself with the quiet ferocity of a place still trying to convince the land it belonged there. 200 people had staked their claim on this wide-open stretch of Dakota grass, and they had built accordingly frame houses with actual windows, a proper mercantile with a painted sign, a church whose steeple you could see from 2 miles out on a clear day. The buildings said something about the people who built them. We are not temporary, we are not frightened, we have arrived and we intend to stay. What the buildings did not say was how thin the margin was between staying and being swept away. The winters did not care about painted signs or church steeples. The winters came regardless, and what held and what didn't was not always a matter of character or industry. Sometimes it was simply a matter of knowing something the winter didn't expect you to know. Harold Voss had been alderman of Harwick for 6 years, and before that he had been its largest landowner. And before that, he had been the man who bought up parcels from homesteaders who couldn't make the second winter. He was not cruel in the way a villain in a story is cruel. He thought of himself as a man who understood how things worked, who could look at a situation and identify the correct outcome before lesser minds had finished reading the first line of the problem. He had a talent for deciding who deserved what, and Harwick had mostly let him exercise that talent unchallenged. He was broad-shouldered and deliberate, the kind of man who occupied a room not by filling it with noise, but by settling into it so completely that everyone else seemed to arrange themselves around him. He had a wife he was polite to and 2 sons he was proud of, and a town that deferred to him, and for 6 years that had been sufficient. Then Lars Lindell had died in September, and the question of what happened to his daughter had given Voss the first real irritation he had felt in years. Lars had been a quiet man, the kind of quiet that comes not from timidity, but from self-sufficiency. A man who simply had no need to announce himself because the work spoke clearly enough. He had come to Dakota from somewhere back east, when Mara was still too young to remember the journey, and he had built a homestead that was modest in its ambitions and serious in its execution. His fields were straight, his fences held, he paid what he owed on time and borrowed nothing he couldn't return, and if he had opinions about the way things were run in Harwick, he kept them to himself with a completeness that Voss had always found either admirable or suspicious depending on his mood. Lars had a gift for being present without being legible, and Voss had never quite settled on whether he liked the man or not. The accident was the kind that made no sense the way accidents often don't. A rattlesnake on a September afternoon, a horse that had been steady for 7 years, a patch of rocky ground where Lars had no business being alone. He was dead before Mara could reach him. She was 17 years old and she knelt in the dry grass beside her father with the sun still high and warm and everything in the world proceeding at normal speed around her. And the thing she remembered most clearly afterward was how ordinary the sky looked, how the clouds didn't stop, how the horse, having shed its panic, stood 20 yards away and cropped the grass like nothing had happened at all. She had come into town 3 days after the funeral with her chin up and her eyes dry, and the look of someone who has used up every internal resource available and is now operating on the stubborn momentum of forward motion alone. She had gone to speak with Dorothy Lars's second wife, hoping for something she could not have named, exactly not warmth, which she had never expected from Dorothy, but perhaps a provisional arrangement, something workable. Dorothy had been pleasant enough during the courtship, the kind of pleasant that exists in the space before a person needs anything from you. After Lars died, she became something else, and she let Mara see it plainly on the third day without apology or softening. The law is clear, Dorothy said, her voice carrying the flat efficiency of a woman who had looked into the question thoroughly before the funeral was cold. Widow inherits. You're not my blood, and you're not my legal obligation. I have no argument with you personally, Mara, but I have no room for you either. Mara stood in the kitchen where she had eaten every meal of her conscious life and looked at the woman standing in it and understood that nothing she said would change the arithmetic. She took her coat from the hook by the door. She took her father's compass from the shelf where it had sat for as long as she could remember, a small brass instrument he had carried from the East when he was younger than she was now. She left without another word because there was no word available that would have been adequate. She walked through the center of Harwick with the compass in her coat pocket and her hands loose at her sides, and the town watched her go. This was the part she had not anticipated, not Dorothy's decision, which had a cold logic she could trace even if she could not accept it, but the watching, the stillness of it. 20, 30 people in the street and in doorways and behind windows, and not one of them moved toward her. She understood intellectually that they were not her enemies, that most of them were simply uncertain what they were supposed to do, that human beings in groups tend to wait for someone else to move first. She understood all of this, and it did not help at all. Harold Voss was standing in front of his office with one hand in his coat pocket and the other wrapped around a mug of coffee he had carried outside. He watched Mara cross the street, and what he said was not shouted. He was not a shouting man, but he pitched it precisely right to carry to the people within earshot, without appearing to address them directly. That's what happens when a girl doesn't make herself useful. A decent woman would have found a way to be indispensable. This one just couldn't be bothered. He lifted his coffee and took a sip. Someone near the mercantile made a small sound that might have been agreement, or might have been a laugh suppressed. Mara did not turn. She did not look at Voss or at any of them. She kept walking until she ran out of town, and then she kept walking after that. She slept the first night in an abandoned hay shelter 3 miles from Harwick, burrowed into corner with her coat pulled tight, listening to the October wind work its way through the gaps in the siding. The cold was not yet serious. The killing cold was still weeks away, but it had enough authority to keep her awake, and she lay in the dark listening to it and taking stock of what she had. The compass. The coat on her back, her father's coat, too large in the shoulders, smelling of wood smoke and engine oil. The knowledge in her head, which was considerable, though she was not yet sure how to deploy it. Lars had taught her everything he knew about managing land reading, weather, preserving food, stretching resources. But Lars had also built a house first, and learned to survive second. And Mara had no house. She thought about old Nels Bergman. She had known Nels since she was small, or known of him, which was slightly different. He was the oldest continuous resident in the county. A man who had been on this land before. There was a town before there were enough settlers to hold a meeting, or elect an alderman, or paint a sign. He lived alone 5 miles from Harwick on a homestead that had the particular quality of a place that had been tended for a very long time by someone who understood what tending meant. He had a reputation for being difficult, for sitting in silence long past the point where most people would have offered pleasantries, for looking at newcomers with an expression that conveyed not hostility exactly, but a kind of extended evaluation, a sense that he was waiting to see whether they would reveal themselves to be worth the effort. Most people found this unwelcoming. Lars had found it honest, and so had Mara. She had sat in Nell's kitchen a dozen times as a child, listening to conversations between him and her father, that she only half understood about the way the ground held moisture, and the way certain hills blocked wind, and the way you could tell 3 weeks before the first snow what kind of winter was coming if you knew where to look. Lars had absorbed these things with the patience of a man who understood that information was the most durable form of capital. Mara had absorbed them too without being asked, because she was the kind of child who listened to conversations not meant for her and remembered them more accurately than the people who had spoken them. She sat at his table and let him put coffee in front of her, and she told him what had happened without elaboration, just the facts in their sequence, and he listened with his hands wrapped around his own mug and his eyes on the table. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I need to show you something, but not today. Today you eat and you sleep, and tomorrow we go look at a piece of land." The land was 30 acres on the south face of a hill 2 miles from Nell's homestead, and 5 from the edge of Harwick's outermost fence. Lars had known about it, had walked it once with Nels years ago, and had decided it was worthless because it was too steep for crops and too exposed for comfortable building. He had never filed on it. The county records showed it unclaimed, one of those odd parcels that had slipped through the machinery of documentation because nobody had wanted it badly enough to do the paperwork. Nels had known about it for 30 years and had left it alone deliberately, the way a man leaves a good card unplayed, because the right hand hasn't come up yet. They stood on the south face in the thin October sunlight, and Nels pointed out what Mara had not yet learned to see: the fold in the terrain that would conceal an entrance from anyone approaching from the direction of town. The particular angle of the slope that would drain water away from any structure built into it. The quality of the soil, dense, cohesive, the kind that would hold its shape under excavation without requiring elaborate reinforcement. The orientation south-facing, which meant the winter sun low in the sky would angle directly into any opening and provide both warmth and light through the coldest months. He had chosen this piece of ground 30 years ago and held it in his memory like a key without a lock waiting. He explained the technique the way he always explained things, not as instruction, but as conversation, as if he were thinking it through again for the first time, and Mara was simply present while he did it. He had learned it from Lakota men who had been on this land since before anyone living could remember. Men who had understood for generations that the earth itself was the most reliable building material available, that the ground maintained a temperature of roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit at sufficient depth regardless of what the air above it was doing. You didn't fight the winter. You went underneath it. You let the earth remember summer for you. The chimney was the thing most people would never see because it looked like nothing. A pipe no wider than a man's fist, its opening set flush among a scatter of rocks that appeared natural from every angle of approach. The entrance would be cut into the fold of the hill at a specific angle, visible only to someone who had been told exactly where to look and approached from the single direction that exposed it. Everything above ground level would be to any observer simply a hillside. The smoke in the morning would be the only evidence, and from a distance, smoke alone could not be sourced precisely. Mara listened to all of it with the focused attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. And when he had finished, she asked 4 questions about load-bearing capacity, drainage angles, chimney draw, and winter supply mathematics. Nels answered each one without impatience. And when she had no more questions, he looked at her with something that was not quite approval, but was in the vicinity of it. "Your father taught you to ask the right things," he said. "That's half the work already." They started digging in the second week of October. The work was hard in a way that was clarifying rather than discouraging. Mara had been strong before farm work had seen to that, but this was different. targeted the specific labor of excavating a space from resistant earth with precision rather than force. She dug while Nels directed his hands, too stiffened with age to manage a shovel, but his eye still calibrated to a degree of exactness that surprised her. He would stop her mid-swing to adjust the angle by 2 inches. He would make her recut a wall section because the face was wrong by a measurement she couldn't see, but he could. He was not gentle about corrections, he stated them flatly and waited for her to comply without commentary. And she found this more useful than encouragement would have been. She did not think about Harwick while she dug. She thought about drainage angles and soil consistency and the precise depth at which the temperature would stabilize. She thought about insulation materials and the load capacity of cottonwood beams cut at the right thickness. She thought about what she needed and how to get it. And the thinking was so complete and so specific that other thoughts had no room to intrude. This was the gift the work gave her, and she accepted it without sentimentality. Word reached Voss in mid-October as she had known it would. In a town of 200 people with little other entertainment, a girl digging into a hillside was going to be remarked upon, and the remarks were going to travel. She had been seen by a farmer checking his fence line 2 miles from the worksite, visible for perhaps 10 minutes, before she became aware of him and moved behind the hill's natural shelter. 10 minutes was enough. By the time the information reached Voss, it had acquired the specific character of information that has passed through several people who found it interesting. It had become a statement about her condition, about what a person reduced to borrowing Nels Bergman's company and digging holes in hillsides must have come to. And the subtext was unmistakable. Look at what happens when someone refuses to accept their circumstances with appropriate grace. Voss organized the first search party 3 days after hearing about it. He brought 11 men, enough to cover the hillside systematically, and he rode out with the purposeful air of someone closing an open question. They spent an hour on the south face walking in overlapping lines and found nothing. The entrance was behind the fold in the terrain, invisible from their approach vector. The chimney pipe was not yet installed. There was disturbed earth, yes, but disturbed earth on a hillside in autumn had a dozen innocent explanations. And when one of the men suggested badgers, Voss could not produce a counter-argument that didn't sound like special pleading. They walked directly over her. She heard it clearly, the specific percussion of boot heels on compressed earth 6 inches above her head, transmitted through the soil with a fidelity that made the space feel suddenly very small. She lay absolutely still on her side with her hand pressed flat against the earth wall and counted the footsteps as they crossed and recrossed and eventually moved away. When silence returned, she remained still for another full minute, regulating her breathing, before she allowed herself to move. Later, Nels told her what the search party's return had looked like from the road. Voss had ridden back through town with the particular tight-shouldered posture of a man who has not gotten what he came for and doesn't intend to explain himself. And the story had made its way into the evening's conversation in the saloon, with a warmth that suggested it was going to be enjoyed for some time. The smoke from nowhere, people were calling it. The mystery on the hill. Some said it was a ghost. Some said it was Mara Lindell, which everyone agreed was functionally the same thing. And this too had produced laughter that Voss had not been part of. He organized a second party in November, then a third. Each time Mara heard them above her, and each time they left without finding what they had come for. By the third search, she had the chimney installed and had learned exactly how thin a thread of smoke it produced, barely visible even on cold mornings, and only from a specific distance and angle. She began to understand that the searches would continue for as long as she remained invisible, and invisibility was something she could maintain. The technique worked. The earth kept its promises. What Voss could not tolerate was not the failure to find her. It was the implication of the failure, which was that a 17-year-old girl with no money and no house and no family had outthought him not once but 3 times and was by all available evidence doing fine. He had told the town she would either freeze or come begging before November, and November was here, and she had done neither. He felt the shape of this the way you feel a stone in a boot, not incapacitating, not the most important thing happening, but present in a way that affected how you moved through every hour. He told people at this December council meeting that Mara Lindell had become a concern, that there had been reports he did not specify from whom, because there were no reports of missing supplies from nearby farms. Small things, a smoked ham, a bushel of turnips, the kind of losses a person might attribute to oversight or weather or animal predation until they began to accumulate. He laid this out in his measured way, the way he laid out all propositions, and watched the room absorb it. Martha Holt, who ran the mercantile, looked at him with a flatness that conveyed she was not convinced. "Harold," she said, "have you had one actual report from one actual farmer, or are you theorizing?" Voss looked at her for a beat longer than necessary, and Martha Holt found something to examine in the papers in front of her, and the room moved on. But the coda to the December meeting was what mattered. 3 men stayed after, and Voss talked to them quietly for 10 minutes. And 2 days later, a 4th search party rode out to the south-facing hill without official authorization. She heard them again, close this time, following a line that suggested someone had been thinking more carefully about the terrain. One pair of boots stopped within 4 feet of the entrance, and she heard a voice she didn't recognize say, "There's something here," with the particular quality of a man who's found a thing but can't yet say what it is. The boots turned in a slow circle. She watched the door in total stillness. The single candle out the fire banked to coals. The boots moved on. She lay in the dark for a long time after they left. The temperature in the room sat at 54 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees at sunset and was still falling, and inside 30 feet of undisturbed soil separated her from all of it. In that stillness, she was aware of something that had not been available to her in the weeks of furious work. She had time to feel not the grief exactly, which was still too large to approach directly, but the texture of what had changed. A year ago, she had been her father's daughter in her father's house in a world that had known her since birth. Now she was 30 feet underground on a hillside no one wanted, and the man with the most power in the nearest town had decided to spend time and social capital making her into a threat. She turned the compass over in her hand in the dark, its brass warm from her palm, and she thought about her father carrying it east to west across whatever distance had brought him here. And she thought he came from nothing and built something real, and it held for 20 years. And then it didn't hold anymore. And that is the thing about the things you build. They hold until they don't, and while they hold, they are real. She relit the candle. She got up. She checked the door seal, checked the chimney, drawer, checked the cold frame she'd built over the root storage to buffer temperature fluctuation. She wrote in the small ledger she kept by the bed supply levels temperature reading structural observations. She wrote, "Searches will continue. Current concealment adequate. Expand storage before December ends. Adjust entrance rock arrangement on northwest side." She closed the ledger and sat for a moment listening to the absolute stillness of the earth around her. And then she said aloud into the empty room, "I'm still here. Not for anyone, just to hear it said." December settled over Harwick like a verdict. The frame houses that had looked solid in October revealed their weaknesses one by one as the temperature dropped. Gaps in the siding that let cold air finger its way through wool blankets. Window frames that expanded and cracked in the freeze-thaw cycle. Stovepipes that drew poorly on windward days and filled rooms with smoke instead of carrying it away. People patched and repatched and told each other the second winter was always the hardest, which was something people said, because it was sometimes true, and because saying it gave the difficulty a shape that implied an end. Mara heard none of this. She was 30 feet below a hillside 2 miles from the edge of town, and December, as far as her thermometer was concerned, did not exist. The dugout was finished by the first week of that month, and finished meant something more complete than she had initially imagined when she began digging in October. The main room ran 12 feet across and 20 feet deep, with walls of packed earth that had been faced with a layer of clay she had sourced from the creek bank and allowed to cure slowly, giving the surface a smoothness that held heat more evenly than raw soil. The bed was built into the east wall cottonwood frame with a rope lattice she had laced herself, topped with a mattress of dried grass sewn into canvas. She had traded 2 days of fence mending labor to acquire from a farm 6 miles north. The table was rough but level. The 2 chairs had taken her 4 evenings to complete and were her private measure of how much she had learned in a short time about working wood with limited tools. The shelves along the north wall held her preserve stores in their specific order. Smoked meat on the top, where temperature was most consistent. Root vegetables in the middle, dried grain at the bottom near the floor, where the earth's coolness prevented any residual fermentation. Everything had a position, everything had a purpose. Nothing was there because it was comfortable to have. The root cellar dropped another 6 feet below the main floor, through a hatch she had fitted with a door that sealed against both moisture and the slight temperature differential between levels.
You must leave now.
Down there,
I won't
she
ask
stored the
again.
things
Please
that
don't
needed to
send
last
me away.
longest. The smoked hams, the dried beans, the corn
Stop
she had
right
ground
there!
herself at a
You
hand
can't
mill she
stop
borrowed
me.
from Nels and returned
This is for
before
your
he
own
asked for it
good.
back.
No.
She had calculated her
Come on
supplies
in,
against
traveler.
a worst-case
It's getting
winter
cold.
scenario. One
Thank you. I was
person,
hoping
6
for some
months
shelter.
minimal exertion.
Of course.
The numbers worked,
Come warm
but
up.
they worked tightly with no
Careful
room
with
for
that side. It's
generosity and
loose.
no margin
I
for
see
error.
it. Just
Nels
keep
came
that
to
post
inspect
ready.
on a morning
Here,
when the outside
me help.
temperature had
Thanks.
dropped to 14 below, and the walk from his homestead had left frost crystals in his beard. He stood in the center of the main room for a long time without speaking, turning slowly, taking in each detail with the expression of a man running a private calculation against an internal standard. He looked at the ceiling beams which he had spaced and notched according to his instruction and her own refinement of it. He looked at the chimney drawer, the ceiling around the door frame, the way the cold frame over the root hatch had been insulated with a double layer of buffalo hide he had given her from a cache he had kept for 30 years. Then he looked at her with something she had not seen from him before, a quality in his attention that was different from his usual evaluative regard. "Your father would be proud," he said. "This is better work than anything I built at your age. Better than most things I built at any age." He didn't stay long. The cold had taken something from him on the walk over, that his body was slow to recover, and she noticed him favoring his right side in a way she filed away without commenting on. Before he left, he stopped at the door and looked back at the room one more time. "They'll never find this," he said, "but someday they may need to." The searches had become a kind of seasonal ritual in Harwick by December. The way some events acquire regularity, not because they produce results, but because stopping them would require an admission nobody wanted to make. Voss had sent 4 parties by the time the ground froze solid, and each one had returned with the same report dressed in slightly different language. Nothing. No structure. No girl. The smoke from the hillside continued to rise every morning, a provocation that Voss could see from the edge of town on clear days, and its persistence had shifted from being an irritant to being something that occupied a specific corner of his attention at all times. What he did instead of talking about it was tell a different story. In January, in the kind of conversations that happened over counters and in doorways, and after Sunday services, he began to say things about Mara Lindell that were not accusations exactly, but occupied the space just beside accusations. That there had been a question about some tools missing from a farm to the north, that a neighbor had mentioned feed disappearing from a storage barn. He was careful never to say she had done these things. He was careful to leave each sentence slightly unfinished in the way that invites a listener to complete it themselves, which meant the conclusion felt like their own idea rather than his. Mara knew none of the specific content of these conversations, but she understood the general shape of what was happening, the way a person can feel a change in air pressure before a storm becomes visible. She knew that invisibility was not the same as safety, that being unfound was a condition that required maintenance. She had structured her supply runs carefully, always at night, always to locations far enough from Harwick that no one would connect the activity to the hillside, always taking nothing that would be noticed missing quickly. She had become, in the practical operational sense, exactly what she had told Nels she needed to become. January also brought something she had not planned for, which was time. The construction was done. The stores were laid in. The critical work of survival had been completed with a thoroughness that left her in the long dark hours of a Dakota winter night, with nothing urgent requiring her attention. And in that space, without the consuming focus of physical labor to fill it, things she had kept at careful distance began to move closer. She thought about her father the most in the early mornings, when the light through the small angled window was gray and thin, and the temperature inside had dropped a few degrees from its overnight stabilization. And she lay in the bed in the particular waking state that exists before full consciousness imposes its practical agenda. Lars had a specific quality she could not have described adequately in words. A kind of patient gravity, the sense that he was fully present in whatever he was doing, without making a performance of it. She had taken it for granted the way children take for granted the things that are most constant. She understood now that it had been unusual, and that her father's quality of attention had been a gift she had not known to name while she had it. She missed him in the way you miss a thing that was also a foundation, not just with grief, but with the structural disorientation of someone who reaches for a wall and finds it gone. She wrote in the ledger every evening. The entries had started as supply records and temperature logs and structural observations. But by January, they had begun to include other things. Observations about what she was learning. Questions she was working through, the occasional line about what she expected and what she'd found instead. She did not think of this as diary keeping. She thought of it as documentation, which was something a person did when they understood that what was being experienced might be worth recording for purposes not yet clear. Nels came twice in January, and the second visit confirmed what she had noticed in December without wanting to confirm. He was thinner. The favoring of his right side had become a sustained compensatory posture rather than a temporary adjustment. He moved with the deliberate care of someone managing pain that had become structural rather than incidental, each step a small negotiation between intention and capacity. She put more food in front of him than she mentioned and watched him eat it without calling attention to the watching. When she walked back with him part of the way to his homestead, he stopped at the top of the hill and turned and looked back at the slope with the smoke rising from it, and his expression was the particular kind of satisfaction that has some sorrow in it too. He said what needed saying without preamble. "I won't make it to another winter after this one. I want you to know I know that, so we don't have to pretend." She stood beside him in the cold and did not offer reassurance, which was what he was asking for, by telling her directly. She said, "Then I need you to tell me everything you haven't told me yet." He nodded once, acknowledging the correctness of this response, and they walked the rest of the way to his house, and he talked for 3 hours without stopping, and she wrote every word in the ledger when she got home. What he told her went beyond construction technique. It was 30 years of accumulated observation about this specific piece of land where the water table sat, how the prevailing wind shifted in different storm systems, which directions danger historically came from, and which were relatively protected. He talked about what the Lakota men who had taught him understood about weather, that most settlers never learned, not because the knowledge was hidden, but because it required a different orientation, a willingness to treat the land as a source of information rather than simply a surface to be worked. He talked about the signs of a coming season, the way a physician talks about symptoms specifically referably, with an understanding that accurate reading required calibrated attention over time. He talked for 3 hours without repeating himself, and she wrote until her hand ached. Voss organized his 5th search party in January. This one was different from the others. He had spent the intervening weeks studying the terrain from a distance, drawing crude maps, thinking about approach angles he hadn't tried. The party came from the east this time, rather than from the direction of town following the creek line, until it bent toward the south face of the hill, and they got close enough that Mara could hear individual voices. She recognized voices among them, lower and more controlled than the others. The voice of a man who had stopped being angry and had become something more focused and therefore more dangerous. They were 20 feet from the entrance when one of the men's horses shied at something in the snow, and the commotion broke their concentration and gave her another 5 minutes of activity noise to use as cover. They did not find the entrance. But this time when Voss left, he did not leave with the tight-shouldered posture of frustrated authority. He left with the particular stillness of a man who has decided he will simply come back. February arrived, and with it the strangeness that Nels had predicted. The temperature swung 40 degrees in 3 days, from bitter cold to an afternoon that felt almost like early spring, then crashed again overnight. The wind shifted from northwest to southeast and back again, in patterns that felt less like weather and more like argument, as if different systems were competing for the same territory. She watched the birds from the small window in the early mornings, large flocks moving south against the conventional logic of the season, as if they had received information the calendar hadn't. The cattle on the farm she could see from higher ground were clustering in ways she associated with their behavior before the worst storms. Nels watched the same sky from his homestead and sent her a note delivered by a farm boy he paid with a meal building. 4 weeks, maybe 5. The kind that comes once in a generation and resets everything. You know what to do. She expanded the secondary room in February without fully understanding why. She had been rationalizing the postponement for weeks, telling herself it was about resource allocation and structural priority. But the truth was simpler and less comfortable. She had been reluctant to acknowledge what the expansion implied about her expectations. A single person preparing for a single winter did not need a secondary room. The expansion meant she was preparing for something larger, and preparing for something larger meant accepting that she believed it was coming. And believing it was coming meant sitting with the knowledge that she had tried to warn the town through a note left at Voss's office door in the 3rd week of January, describing the signs and the calculations and the specific preparations she recommended, and Voss had read it and thrown it into the fire. She knew this because the farm boy had waited outside the office window and come back to report. She dug the extension anyway. She framed it and faced the walls and added a second cold frame over a secondary storage hatch. She folded 12 wool blankets and stacked them on the shelf and did not think about who might use them. She thought about the folding. In the first week of March, she made a final supply run 20 miles east to a depot far enough from Harwick that the transaction would mean nothing to anyone who heard about it. She came back with lamp oil salt, a second coil of rope, and the wool fabric she cut into blankets over 3 evenings. She stored everything in its designated position. She checked the chimney seal one more time, running her fingers around the interior fitting to confirm it would shed snow rather than collect it. She added wood to the fire until the heat was higher than she needed. She filled the water reservoir inside the lower hatch. She did every item on a mental list she had compiled over weeks, and when she was done, she sat down at the table with the ledger and a cup of coffee and waited. The morning of March 2nd began warm enough to be suspicious. The sky had the flat, textureless quality that experienced plains people recognized as a held breath. Not calm, but suspended the atmosphere, gathering itself for a release it had already decided on. She stood at the entrance in the early morning and looked at that sky for a long time. The temperature was 38 degrees, dramatically warmer than the preceding days, and in a Dakota March, that specific anomaly carried the same quality as a debt coming due. She went back inside. By noon, the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. By 3 in the afternoon, it had fallen another 20, and the wind had begun. Not the gradual build of a normal storm, but an immediate sustained roar 60 miles an hour from the northwest, driving snow so dense it was less like precipitation than like the atmosphere itself becoming solid. The light through the small window went white and then went dark as snow packed against the glass from outside in less than an hour. She lit the lamp. The temperature in the room held at 53 degrees. The fire ate its fuel steadily, And without drama, the small chimney pipe above sending its thin evidence up through the white obliteration of a storm that was remaking every surface for as far as any instrument in any direction could measure. She could not see Harwick from where she was. She had never been able to see Harwick from inside the dugout, but she could imagine it. And she did not with satisfaction. There was nothing in her that wanted what was happening to the people in those frame houses, but with a terrible clarity. She knew what the buildings there would be doing under this weight. She knew what would happen when the fuel ran short. She knew the specific timeline of a situation that began with inconvenience and moved in this kind of cold and this duration of wind through discomfort and into danger, with a speed that people who had not experienced it always underestimated, until they were already past the point of easy correction. She sat with this knowledge in the lamplit room while the earth held its temperature around her. And the storm did everything it intended to do above, and what she felt was not triumph and not vindication, and not grief exactly, but something that had no clean name, the compound weight of being right about a thing you wished you'd been wrong about, of being safe in a situation you would have traded your safety to have prevented. The storm took 7 days to finish what it had started. Mara kept a tally on the inside of the door frame, a small mark for each time she completed a full sleep cycle, and woke to find the wind still present. The sound of it from underground was not the howling that people described when they talked about blizzards. It was lower than that, more structural a vibration that communicated itself through the earth itself as much as through the air. On the 4th day, she pressed her palm flat against the east wall and stood there for a long moment feeling the storm from the inside out. And what she felt was the earth's complete indifference to the argument happening above it. The temperature held. The walls did not shift. Whatever the wind was doing to everything that stood upright on the surface of the plains down here, nothing moved. She rationed her own activity as carefully as she rationed her food. She structured the days. Morning inventory of stores, temperature log inspection of the chimney drawer. Midday hours given to the physical tasks that kept the space maintained and gave her body something to do. Evenings with the ledger writing, not because she had news to record, but because the act of organizing thought into sentences was itself a discipline, a way of confirming that her mind remained ordered when there was very little outside her mind that was. On the 5th day, she ran the numbers again, which she had been avoiding because she already knew what they would show. Her stores calculated for one person over 6 months were going to last. But the secondary room she had extended into the hill in February sat empty and provisioned with a secondary cache, and the blankets she had folded on the shelf in the first week of March were still folded exactly as she had left them. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the door to that room for a while. Then she went back to the ledger. The 7th day arrived with a change in the quality of the silence. The vibration in the walls had shifted, not stopped, but reduced to something intermittent rather than continuous. The storm releasing its grip in stages, the way very large things stop rather than all at once. By mid-morning, the wind had dropped enough that she could hear individual gusts as distinct events rather than as a sustained condition. And by afternoon, the light through the cleared window had changed from the flat white of total cloud cover to something with directionality, actual shadows moving across the glass. She did not go outside. The calm that followed the storm's first retreat was a well-known trap, a pause that invited movement before the conditions had stabilized enough to make movement survivable. She knew this. She stayed in. On the 8th day, the pause held long enough to be believed, and she opened the door for the first time since the storm had begun. The landscape she stepped into had no relationship to the one she had left. Every surface had been remade. The fold in the hillside that concealed her entrance was buried under a drift that had shaped itself into a form that bore no resemblance to the terrain beneath it. The sky above was the specific blue that only appears after a major weather system has scoured every particle of suspended matter from the air, a blue so saturated it looked artificial. The cold was the dry, total kind that attacked exposed skin in under a minute and had a clarity to it that was almost beautiful from inside a warm structure and was lethal from outside one. She stood in the entrance and looked toward where Harwick was and could not see it. The distance and the altered terrain swallowed it. But the direction she knew from her father's compass, and she looked that way for a long time before she went back inside to wait. What she waited for was smoke. By mid-afternoon, she had seen nothing rising from the direction of Harwick. This told her something she had not wanted to know. She did not have to wait much longer after that. She heard them before she saw them. Not voices, but the specific compression of packed snow under a line of feet, a sound that carried across frozen ground with accuracy. She positioned herself at the entrance with the door slightly open, and when they appeared around the fold in the hillside, they were a ragged line of 23 people strung out over 50 yards, the stronger ones near the front, and the ones who needed help distributed through the middle, and at the front of the line was Harold Voss. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together in the wrong order. His coat was the same coat she had seen him wear in front of his office in September. The coat of a man with buildings and a stove and no reason to own anything heavier. And it had not been adequate for what the last 8 days had required of it. His face carried the particular discoloration of frostbite partially sustained and partially avoided patches of pale skin at the cheekbones that had not fully resolved a rawness around the mouth and forehead. He was walking under his own power, but the walking had the quality of a man using reserves he did not have, making a series of decisions to continue that required renewal with each step. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. The people behind him stopped too, a slow compression as those in the rear caught up to the stillness at the front. Nobody spoke for a moment that had the particular weight of moments that both sides have been moving toward without being able to see clearly. Voss looked at her with eyes that held nothing she recognized from the man who had stood outside his office with a coffee mug and announced to the street that she had brought her situation on herself. That man had been occupied by a version of himself he was comfortable with. This man had been emptied of that comfort by 8 days of accumulating consequences, and what was left was simply a person who had run out of every resource except the one that had sent him in this direction. His voice, when it came, had lost the carrying quality she associated with him, the timbre of a man who speaks to rooms. I know I have no right to ask anything. He stopped there, swallowed, looked at the people behind him, and then back at her. There are children, 3 of them. There's a woman with frostbite I can't assess properly. We've had nothing since yesterday morning.
You must
Mara
leave
did
now.
not let
I
him
won't
finish.
ask again.
She
Please
asked the
don't
only
send me
question that
away.
mattered. How many? Her voice
Stop
was level,
right
and she
there!
meant it as a
You
practical
can't
question.
stop me.
This is for
23
your own
counting
good.
me.
No.
She
Come
stepped
on in,
back from the
traveler.
doorway
It's
and
getting
held the door
cold.
open.
Thank you. I was hoping
Come in,
for some shelter.
children first, then
Of course.
anyone who
Come
can't
warm
walk
up.
well on their own.
Careful with
There's a
that
secondary
side. It's
room through
loose.
the back half.
I see it.
It's
Just keep
lower,
that
but it's
post
dry
ready.
and it's
Here,
the same temperature.
Let me help.
Thanks.
We'll sort the space once everyone's inside. What followed was not graceful. 23 people who had spent 8 days in deteriorating conditions burning furniture for heat. Managing a succession of structural failures and watching 17 of their neighbors die did not enter a warm space with composure intact. Some of them wept. Some sat down on the floor the moment they were through the door and stayed there. One man stood against the wall with his eyes closed for 10 full minutes, not sleeping, just absorbing the fact of warmth through every surface of his skin simultaneously, as if he needed to prove it to his body before he could address his mind. The 3 children had the specific stillness of very young people who have been frightened beyond the ordinary range and have arrived at a kind of exhausted calm that is not peace but is the other side of panic. Mara gave them food first. She had done the arithmetic before they arrived, running the numbers in her head, while she watched the line come around the fold of the hill. Her stores would support 23 additional people for approximately 14 days at restricted but survivable rations. Enough calories to keep a body warm and functional, not enough to feel full, the kind of eating that is entirely about maintenance with nothing available for comfort. She explained this to the room without apology or softening. because false reassurance would have been a cruelty in a situation where people needed accurate information to make accurate decisions. We have food for 2 weeks if we're careful. We'll be careful. No one goes below their share and no one takes above it. She looked around the room. Nobody objected. The first night was the hardest in ways she had anticipated and ways she hadn't. The space was warm enough for 24 people. The Earth's thermal constancy was indifferent to occupancy in the way that made it superior to any insulated structure above ground. But the density of bodies in a room designed for one created a specific human difficulty that had nothing to do with temperature. These were people who had spent 8 days in the accelerating dissolution of every social structure that normally organized their lives. And they had arrived at a place belonging to someone most of them had dismissed, mocked or simply allowed to be dismissed and mocked without objection. And the compound weight of that was present in the room as a physical thing not spoken but not absent. Voss spent the first night sitting against the wall with his knees pulled up and his eyes moving around the room in an inventory that was clearly not about assessing the space, but about processing something internal. Mara watched him in the intervals between tending to the frostbitten woman, and what she saw in his face was not the efficient self-examination of a man identifying his errors in order to avoid them in future. It was something rawer and less organized than that, a man confronting not a mistake, but a disposition, not a bad decision, but the pattern of thinking that had produced a series of them across years, and finding the confrontation more than he had expected it to be. On the second day, he tried once to organize. It was reflexive rather than calculated. Someone asked a logistical question about sleeping arrangements, and Voss answered it with the automatic authority of a man accustomed to being the person who answered such questions. Mara waited until he had finished, and then said without heat, without any quality in her voice that could be called aggressive, "I appreciate the help. In this house, I'll make the arrangements." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been established that everyone needed established, but no one else was going to say. Voss looked at her and then nodded once, and that was the end of it for the day. On the third night, Margaret Forsyth's labor began. She had been 7 months along when the storm hit, and the combination of cold exposure and physical stress had moved things forward in ways that admitted no delay. Mara had no formal medical training that extended to this, but she had the handbook her father had kept. She had clean water and lamp oil and the particular steadiness that had carried her through every previous crisis without exception. And she worked through 3 hours of it with a concentration so complete that the room around her receded to peripheral awareness. The baby was small, too small, and her first sound was thin and high, and stopped the breath of every person in the room. Then it continued. Then it did not stop. The breath of 23 people recommenced in rough synchrony, and the room was briefly entirely unified, in a way it had not been before and might never be again. Margaret looked up from the blanket and found old Nell sitting in his corner with his eyes on the infant, and she asked him to name her, because she wanted the child to carry a name from someone who understood what it meant to endure. Nels was quiet for a moment, his face doing something complicated. "Nora," he said finally. "My mother's name. She crossed these plains before there were towns out here, before there were roads or maps worth trusting. She would have liked this place." He looked back at the baby with an expression Mara had never seen on him before, something unguarded and final, as if he were passing something forward that he had carried a long time. Nora Forsyth was 6 days old when Nels died. He had been weakening since the day after their arrival. The cumulative toll of the journey through the storm and the weeks of illness preceding it working their final accounting. Mara sat with him through the last hours of the 6th day. He held her hand with a grip that was weaker than she expected from hands she associated with decades of physical labor, and he said the things that needed saying in the order of their importance. And he said them plainly, in the way he said everything that she had built, something better than anything he could have taught her to build, without her own additions and refinements. That the knowing she carried now was not just hers, but something she was obligated to pass forward to anyone willing to receive it. That the people in this room were going to remember these days for the rest of their lives. And what they remembered would depend partly on how she carried herself from here. He paused for a while after that, his eyes on the ceiling beams he had directed her to space and notch 5 months ago. Then he said, "The earth doesn't hold grudges, neither should you, not because they deserve it, because you do." He died between one breath and the next, with no drama and no last words beyond those, and the 22 people still living sat with it for a long time, in the particular silence of a space where grief and gratitude have become indistinguishable from each other. The storm's aftermath extended for 10 more days beyond Nels's death, before the relief expedition managed to clear enough road to reach Harwick's county. They came with wagons and medical supplies and journalists because disasters of sufficient scale acquire documentation even when the documented would prefer privacy. What they found was Harwick nearly destroyed. 17 dead in the town proper, additional losses spreading out from it in every direction. Buildings standing but gutted, their contents burned against the cold. A town that had believed in its own solidity and had learned in 7 days the specific lesson that solidity is not the same as survival. And on a hillside 2 miles from the edge of the wreckage, a dugout with 23 survivors. One newborn and a fresh grave marked with a flat stone that someone had carried from the creek bank. Voss stood before the assembled survivors and the relief workers and the journalists who had their notebooks open, and he said what he had been composing for 6 days in the corner of the dugout. He stood with no notes and no preparation visible, and his voice carried for the first time since the storm. Without any of the careful calibration he had always applied to it, the quality of a man who has stopped managing the impression he makes and is simply saying the thing. I owe this woman my life and the lives of everyone standing behind me. I owe her an apology that I cannot make adequate with words, but I'll try anyway. I called her a vagrant. I organized 4 search parties to find her and drive her further away from any chance of shelter or community. I told this town she was a threat, and the town believed me because I was the person they were accustomed to believing. And I used that trust to serve my own need to be right about things. Samandi. His voice went unsteady on the next part, and he let it. When the storm came and everything I said was solid turned out not to be, she opened the door and let us in. She fed us from stores she had built herself. She kept us warm in a structure she had designed and dug with her own hands. She did not once in 14 days remind us of what we had said and done. I was wrong about her. I was wrong about what survival looks like. Wrong about what preparation means. Wrong about what kind of person builds something the rest of us can't find until we desperately need it. He turned to Mara then, and the journalist wrote down what they saw on his face, though no description they filed would adequately capture it. You are the most capable person I have ever been in a room with, and I spent 6 months treating that as something to be afraid of. The journalists turned to Mara, and she stood before them with the same quality she had stood before every other difficulty, not diminished by it, not inflated by it, simply present in it. She thought about what Nels had said about obligation, about what it meant to hold knowledge that other people needed. She thought about her father, who had carried a compass west across a distance she could not fully imagine, and had built something real and had tried to pass it forward. She said, "You can laugh at someone's preparations. You can call them names for what they're willing to do to stay alive, for the hole they dig or the smoke they make or the way they disappear from view when everything else seems fine. But the storm doesn't know about any of that. The storm comes regardless. And when it comes, the only thing standing between the people you love and what the weather intends for them is whether someone somewhere was paying attention when paying attention was still possible." She paused and looked past the journalists and the survivors and the relief workers out at the hillside where the thin thread of smoke was still rising from the ground that had kept its temperature through all of it. The earth doesn't care who was right. It was warm for all of us the same. What followed was slow and partial and real, which is how things actually change, rather than how stories sometimes present them changing. Harwick rebuilt, and the rebuilding incorporated things it hadn't before: root cellars dug properly, storm provisions calculated by people who had learned what 7 days of wind could actually require, a different and more careful relationship to the information carried by people who had been paying attention longer than everyone else. Mara taught the technique to anyone who came to learn it, which in the first year was 11 people, and in the second year was more than that. And she taught without charge, because the logic of knowledge that can save lives operates by different rules than the logic of other commodities. Erik Olsen had come with the relief wagons as a carpenter brought to assess structural damage and assist with rebuilding. He was a quiet man with a quality of attention Mara recognized immediately. The kind of person who looked at a thing for a long time before he said anything about it. He spent 2 hours inside the dugout on his first day, not speaking, moving slowly through both rooms, studying the ceiling construction and the wall facing and the precision of the door frames fit. When he finally turned to her, his first question was not about the construction. He wanted to know about the secondary room, why she had built it in February, what had made her trust an impulse she couldn't yet name with a reason. She told him the truth, which was that she hadn't trusted it so much, as she had decided not to argue with it. He nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing information in a place they intend to return to. He stayed in Harwick when the wagons left. 2 years later, they were married on the hillside above the dugout, on a day when the sky was clear in every direction, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up in the windless air. Voss resigned the aldermanship in April and sold his land holdings by summer, not precipitously, but with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that the structures he occupied no longer fit what he intended to be. He did not leave Harwick, which was the harder choice and the one that meant something. He stayed, and he spent the years that followed doing the kind of work that has no public dimension, repairing fences for people who couldn't manage it themselves, delivering cordwood to households with no one able-bodied enough to collect it, showing up at the edges of things with his labor and no expectation of acknowledgement. He and Mara did not become friends quickly or easily, but they became something real. The particular relationship of two people who know exactly who each other is because they have seen each other clearly under conditions that admit no pretense. The grave on the hillside was marked with the stone from the creek bank, and the words that Mara cut into it herself over the course of 3 evenings with a chisel and a patience she had not known she possessed until she needed it. He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive. It was the most accurate summary she could produce of what Nels Bergman had been and what he had given. And she said it aloud once quietly when she finished cutting the last letter to no one but the hillside and the open sky and whatever attention the earth itself was paying. The phrase "smoke from nowhere" moved through the language of the Dakota settlements in the years that followed, traveling the way true things travel, not through instruction, but through use, through the moment when someone reaches for the right description of a thing they have seen, finds it already waiting. It meant any preparation that looked like strangeness until the day it looked like the only thing standing between the people you loved and what the world intended for them. Old-timers used it as shorthand for a longer argument that the people who seem to be hiding are sometimes simply getting ready for something the rest of the world hasn't thought to prepare for. Yet that the smoke rising from nowhere is always rising from somewhere, that the question worth asking is not why someone is building something you can't see, but whether you'll be grateful for it when the storm arrives. The storm always arrived. That was the one thing everyone in Harwick agreed on after the winter of 1887, the single proposition on which no dissent was possible. The storm arrived. And what determined who you were when it was over was not who you had been before it came, but what you had been willing to build in the months before it, when building was still possible, when the sky was still clear, and the impulse to prepare could still be dismissed as excessive, as unnecessary as the behavior of someone who didn't understand that things were fine and would continue to be fine, as the behavior of someone who was perhaps not quite right in the way that ordinary, confident, unafraid people were right. Mara Lindell kept the ledger for 40 years. The entries changed over those decades, from supply records to temperature logs, to teaching notes to observations about the land's patterns that accumulated into something that had no simple name. Part science and part memory, and part conversation with a man she had lost and a father she had lost before him. The last entry, written in the winter of 1926, when her handwriting had acquired the particular quality of age, still legible, still precise, but carrying its effort visibly, was 3 sentences. She wrote, "The Earth stays at 55 degrees. It has never varied by more than 2 degrees in all the years I have measured it. It remembers summer even when everything above it has forgotten." The smoke rose every morning from the hillside. It rose in the winters that followed, and the winters after those, thin and grey and patient, a signal that said something warm is here. Someone kept the fire burning. Someone was paying attention when the rest of the world was not.